Good afternoon, everybody. If we're on air, then it's now that we must begin our session. Transatlantic Foresight 2040, comparing and assessing scenarios for common challenges ahead. Well, my name is James Elles. I'm chairman of the Transatlantic Policy Network, but I'm also honorary president of ESPAS, and I'm very honored to chair this great session this afternoon. One of my favorite sayings comes from Victor Hugo. He says, you can resist the invasion of armies, but you cannot resist the invasion of ideas. And so as background to our discussion today, I applied this philosophy when drafting the original budget amendment for the EU 2010 budget, setting out details for the pilot project which initiated the ESPAS process. Odd as it may seem, this amendment was proposed not only with the intention of establishing foresight within the EU institutions, but it was also done after discussion with, and I must say, great encouragement of Matt Burrows, who was then the author of the National Intelligence Global Trends report. We shared the thought that we should develop a transatlantic dimension to foresight. And indeed, in 2010, the EU ISS and the NIC published a joint document entitled Global Governments 2025 at a Critical Juncture. Once produced, this was presented to the European Parliament Foreign Affairs Committee for discussion and review. So I must say, after more than a decade, I'm really delighted to chair this session entitled, as I said, Transatlantic Foresight 2040. And we have a stellar cast to be able to respond to this title. Our two main speakers in the conversation are Maroš Šefčovič and Langan-Riekhof. Maroš, you are now in your third term as commissioner, responsible in particular, I should say, for institutional relations and foresight. I won't mention all the other things that you have to look after in your daily job, but it's really nice you could spare the time to be with us today. And under your vigorous leadership, the number of initiatives which we've been hearing about during the conference, not least the annual Strategic Foresight Report, whose second edition released this summer, looked at the EU's capacity to act, and more particularly, the JRC published a report on shaping and securing the EU's own open strategic autonomy for 2040 and beyond. And Maria, after nearly 30 years in the intelligence community, you are now director of the Strategic Futures Group at the National Intelligence Council of the United States, leading the intelligence community's assessment of global dynamics and charged with producing the quadriennial Global Trends product. Your latest report, entitled Global Trends 2040, A More Contested World, the seventh in line since 1997, was published recently. I might add, for as a historical note in this conversation, we did take your ways of doing Global Trends reports when we started our own ESPAS reports to put them onto a 5-year cycle, although yours is, of course, on a 4-year one. And our two commentators are Florence. Florence Gaub is currently Deputy Director of the EU ISS in Paris. And the EU ISS has played a critical supporting role in ESPAS from the outset in 2010. She penned the latest ESPAS Global Trends report, has just had a session just now, on Global Trends 2030, Challenges and Choices for Europe. Awesome. Well, Bruce, you're the Executive Director of the Transatlantic Task Force. Together or alone, choices and strategies for transatlantic relations for 2021 and beyond. I'm right in saying you were at the first ESPAS conference and probably at most of the other ones. Anyway, we've greatly valued your friendship and insights ever since the beginning, and it's very nice to see you here on the board. And of course, as I was saying just before we came on air, it's a great pity that neither you nor Maria could be with us. Everything was planned to come, but you cancelled your plans a couple of days ago because of what's happening in COVID in the Belgian capital. It's a great pity, but we'd like to welcome you back shortly and to be able to see you in the flesh. And it'd be very nice to think we can do a conversation next year, I think, in the flesh, as so much of our business has recently been online. So let's move to the procedure. I'll ask central questions to our main conversationalists before then bringing in our commentators. And then hopefully being able to pick up questions if there are from the audience. It is a kind of online audience, even if we can't see you. And then commentators, I would ask them comments from the main speakers towards the end so that to give your final remarks and then wind up the session. So I think without a moment now to lose, we come to the first question, a set of questions, if I might put it this way. And I'll give them to both you, Maroš, and to you, Maria. But Maroš, if you'd like to start off with 5 minutes in mind, thinking of two questions, which is one, what has been the recent developments for foresight in the EU over the past 5 years? And what are the main challenges you have found facing the EU as a result of these analyses? Maroš, over to you.
Thank you very much, James. And first and foremost, I also would like to greet all esteemed panelists. And in particular, it's a pleasure that we can do it together with our American colleagues. So Maria, you're very welcome. And we indeed hope that you'll have a chance to meet each other personally and to really push, I would say, this transatlantic or global approach to the foresight, because now I think in this highly volatile global environment, I think we need foresight more than ever. And I think the wisdom of James was clearly proven that he was pushing for the budget already a decade ago. And I have to say that also President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, as a former defense minister, I think she had a good foresight to actually nominate one of her commissioners to be for the first time in charge of it on the political level. Because I think what we've been missing in the past was that we had wealth of wisdom in Europe. We have excellent analysts, and we produce fantastic studies and the papers. But there was certain, disconnect between the analytical world and the actionability, and I would say the political follow-up to what our analysts are telling to us. And I think here we clearly felt that we need to catch up. That the last decade was really marked by very important crises, be it financial crisis, migration crisis, or as we have also seen then the health crisis with all the, I would say, economic aftershocks. And very often we have to say that there was like writing on the wall that analysts been telling us that something like this might be happening, but there was not let's say the political outlet which should bring this inconvenient truth to the political level and to start the process of collective thinking, how to act upon that possible negative scenarios. And we clearly want to learn from, I would say, this last decade, and also learn from our friends. And therefore we are now working on multiple levels. I think we have clearly the foresight becoming embedded into our processes. So any policy or future legislative proposals we put on the table, we are also combining it with the foresight and with future-proofing of our policies. And secondly, we are also making sure that in our political cycle every year we try to come up with our strategic foresight report, which informs then the program speech of our president in the State of the Union, and which is later on translated into the Commission work program. And I'm kind of at the beginning and at the end of the process, the beginning with the foresight report, and then at the end, because I'm also responsible for actually putting the ideas coming from the State of the Union speech into the Commission work program. So I think the political cycle, the acknowledgement that we need this is there. And what I think we are struggling right now with, and it would be, of course, very interesting to learn from American perspective, is how to select the key topics, how to make this the foresight really strategic. Because for me, strategic, it means that it has political relevance, that it's actionable, that it leads to the concrete action, and how to, of course, keep my colleagues on the top political level interesting, how to present their reports which are digestible and which are concrete enough that they would warrant action. And I have to say that now in Europe we are very clear on how useful this anticipatory modern governance technique is. So we see that more and more prime minister is building the foresight units next to them. We see that this long-term approach to the policy making is taking root. Yesterday, our conference was opened by the Lithuanian prime minister, who just launched the process on Lithuania 2050 strategy. I was participating in a similar launch of very ambitious program presented by Spanish Prime Minister Sanchez on Spain in 2050. And we see more and more of these strategies coming, and this long-term approach being promoted in our member states. And what I would conclude with, not to dwell too long in my introductory remarks, I think that what is very important is to have, I would say, this national approach, national perspective for us Europeans, of course, the perspective of the EU, but we see that the world is so interconnected, so mutually impacted, that I think to have kind of global approach, to have some kind of, I would say, global community on the Foresighters where we can compare our analysts, when we can study each other perspectives of how the world would evolve in the future, I think would be very natural next step, so we can confront each other with how we see the future. And I think that here, of course, US and the EU would be the natural partners, and I think it would be, I would say, the next step which we can develop after, of course, consolidating our foresight capacities in Europe, to also develop the good, close relationship with our international partners, so we would understand better their perspective on the future of the world, because we are so interconnected and we are impacting each other developments in a way we couldn't imagine 20, 30 years ago.
Well, thank you very much indeed. That's very coherent, but it's very true just how much foresight has become part of everyday life, which it wasn't 5 years ago. But as you are now the first person in a governmental position responsible for foresight, I don't know how many others there are across the world, you are, I think, indeed in a unique position. Maria, please. Could you turn on your mic? Thank you.
Good afternoon, or good morning to those who are on my side of the Atlantic. And thank you for the opportunity to join this really impressive panel. It's been a privilege to return to ESPAS this year and to hear how this critical work has continued under the unprecedented conditions of the past 18 months. I've had the opportunity to listen to a number of the panels over the past 2 days. I've heard great debates, and just listening to the last panel, critical issues, thinking about the meaning of power going forward, challenging assumptions about the impact of demographics. Great debates have been raised throughout the past 2 days. But I've also heard widespread consensus, significant agreement about those challenges that are facing us going forward. I think over the past 18 months, we've all learned really important lessons about personal and societal resilience and adaptation. Lessons I believe are going to be critical for how we manage these challenges in the future. And I hope that next year we can once again come together to have these conversations and to share these lessons in person. So James, turning to the questions you asked us to address in these opening remarks, over the past 5 years in the US and at the NIC, at the National Intelligence Council, we really have tried to remain focused on what we see as our primary mission, and that is producing objective, strategic, and estimative analysis for US policymakers. Serving as the strategic think tank for the US intelligence community and US policymakers over the past 40 years, most of our estimates are tailored to US interests and policies and have largely remained classified. However, our current director, Avril Haines, has promoted a greater transparency, and she's encouraged us to share the work of the intelligence community with the American people and with the wider world. I think you can see evidence of this, of her commitment, in the number of papers and products, both unclassified and declassified, that we've posted on her DNI website. My team has had the chance to produce a number of these estimative products. As you mentioned, the Quadrennial Forecast Global Trends, which we released in the spring, and more recently, we released the National Intelligence Estimate on Climate Change. I think in both of these products, we're attempting to look into that distant future. We're putting key trends in broader contexts. We're trying to give readers a sense of those systemic challenges and those broader implications. So turning to global trends, this 7th edition of Global Trends, we called 2040 a more contested world. And we really built on the 25-year history of the project, identifying, exploring really those broad structural forces that we believe are laying the foundation, are shaping the contours of our long-term future. And we explored those in 4 categories. And they're very similar categories to the ones we've seen in several of your reports. You know, we've looked at demographics, a greater emphasis on the environment this time. We looked at a broad range of technologies and even economics, which is more uncertain in these other trends. And then we try to assess how populations and leaders are reacting to and engaging with these trends at every level. The 2040 paper is data rich. It's highly descriptive of trends we are seeing, and then we attempt to paint in broad brushstrokes that strategic landscape. The NIE, National Intelligence Estimates, are really the flagship across a broad range of issues, often having a shorter time frame than, say, global trends. But this one, we did attempt to look out 20 years because of the nature of the changes to the Earth's climate. Here, we reached broadly across the US government, harnessing that scientific expertise. And then we tried to explore various types of risks to national security, those posed by climate dynamics. We examined 3 categories of risk in this edition. We looked at geopolitical tensions over responses to climate change. Secondly, we looked at those geopolitical flashpoints that are really being created by changes to the Earth's climate. And last, we looked at the climate impacts on country-level stability, trying to look at individual countries as well as regions most impacted by climate changes and that could really cause vulnerabilities for those governments. Turning to your second question, what are the main challenges that we see facing the United States as a result of this analysis? I think we have to think about the role of the intelligence community in describing the message that we delivered. As the intelligence community, we have a primary mission to warn. Our forecasts, we call them estimates most of the time, lean toward an assessment of challenges and risks along the road to the future. The warning job for this edition, I think, was particularly complex because as we identified, we see the critical challenge as that nexus of rising geopolitical tensions, or as we describe, contestation, and intensifying and more frequent global challenges crossing our borders. We noted repeatedly throughout this edition that competition is likely to reach the highest levels since the Cold War, and at the same time, these shared global challenges, many of which we're experiencing right now, from climate, disease, financial crises, disruptions from technologies, are likely to manifest more frequently and intensely in every region. I think it's important to point out that these 2 problem sets are both intimately related and filled with trade-offs, which is why in Global Trends, we use scenarios to illustrate some of those potential choices as well as those implications. I'll stop there and turn it back to you, James.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much indeed, Maria. You've set out the scene beautifully, exactly what you've been doing. Maroš, do you want to make any comment at this stage about what Maria has said? Because it seems to be a very rich kind of area of the things that they're working in and not a million miles away from what we're doing in Foresight and ESPAS in the European Union.
I think there is a lot of overlap because we're also working with scenarios where we embraced this new technique. We looked where the Europe would be in 2040, 2050, from scenario on green leadership through the prospect of complex prosperity, or what would happen if we would favor economic growth about everything else, or if, let's say, we would not do our job properly, what would be the consequences if we would retreat inwards. And of course, I mean, the scenario building is there to kind of, I would say, focus the attention of the Foresight intelligence community, but also the decision makers, because it gives us the opportunity to choose what future we want, or as I said yesterday, also the future we don't want. And we have to work on I would say, the better prospects right now. And I think that what would be extremely useful, and here I think that US already developed quite well-functioning system. This is something what we will try to set up in Europe. It's kind of EU early warning system that we have to improve our horizon scanning. It has to be more to the point. It should be regular. We should be picking up the weak signals about what might be, let's say, on the table of decision makers and work with, I would say, this information. What, of course, I would say would be the most challenging elements for Europe in the next decade would be how to cope with the global climate change, because we set out extremely ambitious path for us. We want to be climate neutral by 2050, but even more intermediate challenges, how to cut our greenhouse gas emission by 55% in 2030. So one of the studies which we did, and I think which is very well appreciated, was our foresight on the green jobs, because there is a lot of course, questions in the wider public that, okay, we would go for, this new economy, what it means, how it would affect the labor market, what kind of skills you would need. And here, actually, the foresight was extremely helpful because we have good answers for this very frequent question. We actually concluded there will be 900,000 new jobs by 2030 just by raising our climate ambitions and increasing our targets. The foresight also gave us the answer to what kind of jobs we are going to have, because there was again the fear that the future will be only for the super high-skilled PhD type of experts, and actually our exercise proven that 75% of this new job would be combination of technical and manual. So I would say there is still huge demand for this type of work, and then you very often get the question for the traditional energy intensive industries, and here we also seen that, of course, the need to embrace the new technologies, but at the same time that embrace would lead to actually 7% increase in employment in those sectors. And I think this is something what you need to ask the analysts to help you to develop the answers for very, I would say, important questions which are very often mainstream in the media and used also by some political players, scaring people about the future, about the need to go, I would say, this extra many miles if it comes to the greener path or greener future for our economies. But I think that what could be particularly interesting for our cooperation would be to share this information and to work together to develop some mechanism of the early warning horizon scanning, because I think it would be very helpful for both of us on both sides of Atlantic.
Well, thank you very much, Maroš, for those insights, and particularly on that early warning system. That's a really interesting idea. But Maria, to come to you a little bit more on the second aspect, on the scenarios, which Maroš was touching on, how great a value is placed on incorporating different perspectives, for example, from countries and cultures in such developments on the scenario planning? Do you think that this is of value? Is this important?
James, I think we're all in agreement that the greater number of perspectives from different areas of the world, from different areas of expertise, from different experiences, all of those are important to scenario development. I've had the privilege over more than 2 decades of being involved in a broad range of scenario work for the US government. And we've employed both analytic techniques, different, as well as computer modeling and strategic conversations, trying to bring in new ideas, to try to identify and challenge our assumptions and our biases, to see different perspectives. With the Global Trends effort, the staff involved in it, kind of goes out broadly around the world, trying to have conversations on every continent. This year, obviously, that that was limited to a significant degree. We definitely turned to virtual ways of having some of those conversations. It's not a perfect substitute, but I was shocked how quickly we were able to adapt and have a broad range of conversations with experts around the world. One of the challenges, I think, is getting perspectives from the non-experts in this type of virtual world, from those who are experiencing some of these trends on a daily basis. As we developed our own kind of first round of scenarios last fall, we sent them out to experts in a variety of fields. We also sent them out to secondary school students and students in undergraduate programs and universities around the United States to see if the ideas resonated, if they saw sort of touchstones for themselves within these scenarios and how they were seeing those unfold in their lives. Because someone who's 18 or 20 years old today, the scenario for 2040 is their world, more than it's my world. So seeing if they react to that and if it seems to explore those things they are looking at was very important. I wish we could have done more of that. I do think COVID made it more challenging to find even more diverse groups around the world, but incredibly important. The more we talk to each other and the more we see perspectives from different parts of the globe, different parts of our societies and different expertise types, the better we're going to do.
Well, thank you very much for that. I must say, looking at you, Florence, and knowing all the huge numbers of people that you had to help you draft and pen the 2019 report and all the visits that you were able or not able to make to different parts of the world before you produced your document, you might well have one or two comments you might like to make on how you managed to produce something but with great talent. Florence, please.
Thank you. I think that our, we obviously have the same title of the report for good reason, because it's inspired by your report. But I think ours is different in the sense that, you're doing it for one state and we're doing it for 27 and then plus the EU as a collective. So it's by definition, one of the things that I wrote in the 2019 report, one of the pull quotes was the future is a discussion space. And I think we rely, what I felt that the 2019 report does is capture how Europeans see the future. And of course, the future is not so much about accuracy, it's what we think is going to happen, and then we act accordingly. So I think in that sense, I felt that the real deal was going to be to get as many Europeans into the conversation to talk about the future, not just Europe's future, but the world's future. So, and I think in that sense, the two reports are different. I would say that the American report relies a lot more on experts actually, giving really detailed input. Of course, you also use scenarios. We don't use scenarios. That's politically a bit more sensitive. So I think it's a very European report in that sense. It reflects what the collective thinks, what the collective fears, what the collective hopes for. So in that sense, similar, I think, objective. But ultimately, I always say foresight is like toothbrush. Everybody needs their own. And I think in that sense, our global trends report is very much a European toothbrush in that sense.
Yes, I think that you'll recognize that EUISS has huge international contacts. And the first report, which we did, which was done by Alvaro Vasconcelos, the director at the time, he drafted a document, but then he went around the globe talking to people, because then he was able to get international perspectives of what Europeans were thinking. So then it was more kind of global trends report rather than just necessarily a Eurocentric report. So yes, there are different approaches here, but I think that if one's thinking about global challenges, as Maroš has put it out so clearly, let's say on climate change, these things are huge. And the more that we can combine and think together and compare notes and to see how we're going to be able to tackle these problems, and then to come to, as you were noticing in your last debate, you have to come to conclusions, you have to come to decisions, not by the foresight community, but the foresight has to inform. I think Maria had that the word was warn. We need to have the warnings there to be able then to take the right kind of decisions. But Bruce, please, your turn to comment.
Thank you, James. And it's a real pleasure and a privilege to be here. And as a consumer of both your reports, I'm really appreciative of the work that you have done in the past and look forward to the future reports. As a point of personal privilege, I started out my professional career in an early foresight effort. I was one of the founders of a place called World Watch Institute, which was the second only environmental think tank in Washington in 1975. And our goal was to create, as the founder of World Watch, Lester Brown used to always say, we're the scouts in front of the wagon train. You know, we're trying to see what's over the next hill and whether there's a problem and how to warn people of what's going on. And I think that this effort is needed even more today than it was then. And I think that there's a couple of issues that have come up in these conversations that, you know, kind of highlight what we as people who worry about foresight need to remind ourselves of and think about and how we integrate. One was Florence mentioned your prediction of what might happen with Chinese demography, a very striking conclusion. Now, given demographic uncertainty, that's probably not exactly what's going to happen. And I think what we have to be very careful about is that it's very easy for the critics of foresight efforts to cherry pick things that were wrong or were off, and then discredit the entire foresight effort. We certainly saw that with the limits to growth, one of the original foresight reports, where people said, well, you underestimated the importance of technology. They did. But they also introduced the whole concept of overshoot and collapse, that we could stress biological systems to the point that they collapse, as fisheries have, as frankly the environment is happening, because we were overshooting the capacity of the atmosphere to absorb carbon. And a point that Maria made that I thought was very important. We need to think about the next generation and how they integrate all of this into their thoughts. Based on my work at the Pew Research Center over the years, and a new report that just came out from UNICEF just recently, people in our societies, in advanced economies, do not believe that the future is going to be better than the present. And I think we need to, as people who worry about foresight, not only look at the objective trends, but the subjective trends. Why is it that people are so pessimistic? And how will that affect their behavior going forward? Does it mean if you're pessimistic about the future, you save less, you invest less? We don't know, but I think those are the kinds of issues that we need to integrate into our thinking much harder than objective trends. But I think that they will influence these outcomes. So I think that we've got a lot of challenges ahead.
Maria, please.
Bruce, those are excellent points. I actually just wanted to respond to the very last thing you were talking about as to how populations respond to some of these trends. This was a critical conversation we had as we were trying to kind of construct the kind of logic of the story of this edition of Global Trends. We knew we needed to kind of describe and lay out the foundational story, those things that we can describe with some fidelity, the issues of demographics and economic trends. But the thing that's harder to tell, but I think equally important, again, is how people are reacting to those trends and how it's shaping their behavior. We called it dynamics, and we looked at 3 levels. We try to look at society, states, and the international system. And the societal section was one we probably spent the most time trying to get right. You know, how do people feel? How are they responding to these dynamics? You know, do they trust government? Do they trust their leaders? How does that shape their behavior? And a critical component of that now, I think, it is technology, and it's social media, and it's how people are absorbing information, but how, you know, for security, for protection, they're also, you know, fragmenting into like-minded groups along a whole range of identity lines. And this varies by region and by country. And again, I know that's very descriptive of what we're seeing now, but I think it's kind of setting the stage for some of what we're likely to see in the future, and also helps us kind of begin to establish those scenarios to push us further into the future. So understanding both those structural forces, but then again, how people are engaging with them, helps us understand what might emerge in the future, with recognizing that we have to bring a lot of humility and a recognition of incredible uncertainty as we're dealing with these issues.
Could I ask you, Maria, before coming to our concluding remarks, we will have to start closing down shortly. How do you deal, you were saying that you were preparing this for policymakers. You're now on your 7th report. How do you engage with policymakers do you spread it right across government? What kind of mechanics, if any, do you have to be able to have results, if you like, as a result of your products?
So as I mentioned, this is an unclassified report, so it is globally available on the DNI's website. But we do work for the president and for U.S. policymakers. So the first recipient of this report was President Biden and his administration and his national security advisors. And then we have offered it across the broad range of U.S. agencies, as well as the United States Congress. So we have had the chance both to deliver virtually and in person, key findings, different aspects of this report. Different recipients are interested in, different parts of the report, which is important to kind of cover, the waterfront in something like this. Now, I want to say one thing about scenarios, and I know we started this conversation about scenarios. One of the reasons we include them in the U.S. edition is because it helps the reader to think about kind of difficult futures, by throwing a date that's a bit far out in the future, and I know it's very hard to get that far out into the future. You can deliver some stories about how things could unfold that may be uncomfortable, and to think about those choices that are made now that might, and I say that with all conditionality, might shape those futures. So those scenarios, I think, help deliver those messages. The panel yesterday on scenarios made a lot of these important points about raising these critical questions, but also developing scenarios that policymakers can kind of see themselves in, can connect to, and then kind of explore those potential worlds. So, we construct these stories to help understand the choices and how these forces can interact in very complex ways.
So how do you take to that, Maroš? Do you think that's a good idea in the way to be able to handle how you're getting the messages across?
Yeah, I think that it's indeed the challenge, because of course, if it comes to our annual strategic foresight report, again, it's a public report, it's institution-wide exercise, and I'm glad that we have more and more buying in that, not only from, of course, within the Commission, from the President, my colleagues, commissioners, but there was interest in the Council. So it means that our 27 member states wanted to debate it on the level of the ministers, and the same in European Parliament, when it becomes also not only, I would say, the topic of a conversation for experts, but more and more for a political level and for the members of the European Parliament. And I think the interest we generated also led us to the fact that the idea which I launched this year to actually create the network of the ministers of future was embraced so warmly by everyone, because I think that in these days, I think we feel that certain distance, strategizing to even, I would say, kind of take away the politicians from this day-to-day operations, and to also focus the minds of the leaders on, how it might look like in the perspective of 10, 20 or more years. I think it's very important. And Maria was referring to this different cultural perspective, and therefore what we did was to reach out to the Singapore experience. I had excellent discussion with the Minister of Future from United Arab Emirates, very impressive lady, Minister Al-Rooney. She was also addressing us yesterday. And I think it helped us to understand the situation better. But I think that to be really well heard by the top political level, they have to see that our information for them is useful, that it's politically relevant, that it's actionable, that it leads to the concrete steps and decision. And I think that's a challenge with which you have to face, because interest is there. We generated lots of political attention, and now we have simply to capitalize on it with really relevant, useful, comprehensive information, and I think that would always warrant the proper attention from the top political level. And the last thing I would mention, we are now in the middle of the conference on future of Europe, where we are debating with the citizens how the Europe should look like in the future. And I know from my interaction, especially with the young people, and I totally agree with Maria, that they are very much interested in these debates. From one side, there is this worry, that fear, and indeed that this generation wouldn't have a better lives than the generation of the parents, which is, I think, new for Western world in the post-war period. From other side, I mean, we see unparalleled energy coming from the young people in tackling the climate change, in being so vocal, in being ready really to go much farther out of the comfort zone. Let's say my generation, to just even the lifestyle, to be simply more responsible consumer, if I can put it in that way. So I think that's a lot what is happening right now, and therefore I think to put our minds together, to figure it out, to understand it better, and to offer the solutions, the different scenarios, I think would be very important. And therefore I think that Foresighters really will have a lot ground to cover.
Might I, as we cut to the end of our discussion, ask you both a question? It's the same question, so but I'll give it to Maria first. I'm wondering really, when you see how much in common that we have on both sides of the Atlantic in terms of foresight work, whether we should consider the possibility of developing a global foresight network or alliance, which would allow us to have ongoing contacts with those countries, particularly in Asia, where we know that we're moving into an Asian kind of more dominated environment quite clearly, and that we're, I mean, transatlantically working to be on an Asian environment might well be a lot of sense. Of course, we've got a debate coming up shortly exactly on this subject, but I don't ask you because of that. I just ask you as a matter of thought that it's not just a kind of platform discussion that we're having, but maybe in the new year we should continue to develop some ideas of how this might develop in the longer term. But Maria, over to you first, and then to you, Maroš.
I think the conversations I've heard over the past couple of days and the interesting conversations I had the chance to have around the world in the building of the last global trends, highlighted to me over and over again the importance of hearing from those doing similar work around the world. Obviously, there are more units like this, more government efforts across Europe in individual countries as well at the level of the EU. I think less so in Asia, but those are developing as well. So having conversations with those different voices, thinking about how the work we do, we incorporate common understandings, or we can raise contrasting views of particular issues. I think all of that is important. How do we formalize that? I think we can have some future conversations about that, and talk about reaching out to diverse groups. I think the opportunities that we've had during the pandemic have opened all of our eyes to the ability to do this virtually and to bring together groups around the world, although some may wake up in the wee hours of the morning or stay up very late at night. We can bring those groups together. You know, it was good to see colleagues in Singapore online yesterday. I mean, I think your instinct for this, James, is correct. We need to think about ways that we push these conversations. But I think when we do that, I think we need to find ways and potentially, you know, analytic efforts to encourage a diversity of views too. We don't want too much like-minded thinking. If we all agree, we're not going to take our analysis, we're not going to take our forecasting to the next level.
That sounds very intellectually invigorating, your challenge. Maroš, what do you think?
I think that to have the, let's say, global perspective and coming from different parts of the globe, I think will definitely help us to understand, you know, the future better. I think it was not so long ago been convinced that the future is multilateral. Then we kind of moved more to the multipolar world, and now, I mean, there's also, you know, reflections on how this world is becoming multinodal, how the relational power is being increased, meaning that you can build a lot of your power around, you know, supporting the infrastructure around building the relationship, you know, with your neighborhood or with wider network of the countries. And clearly, I mean, we are going through, I would say, let's say, well-established global world order, which we have seen before through, I would say, very, very dynamic development. And therefore, I think that to kind of expose our perceptions, to compare it with the assessment or evaluation of or the view of our partners from, let's say, more distant territories to ours. And of course, Asia is going through very, very dynamic development right now. I think could be only useful. And I think that what we need to do is to just think and reflect how can we do it in a practical way that it would actually lead us to enrich our perception, our mutual understanding, of course, better foresight.
Well, I think that on that very positive note, Maroš, and to you, Maria, thank you very much indeed for having animated our conversation, and of course, to Florence and to Bruce to have been able to be part of this dynamic conversation, I think, because I don't think this is the beginning of the end. It looks more like the end of the beginning, and we see what happens then in the new year when we can actually begin to travel. That, Maria and Bruce, will no doubt be a relief that we might be able to have you over here in Brussels or wherever, and then we might also be able to visit you in Washington. In any case, but I thank you all very much indeed for this conversation. And I think we kind of come around the consensus that we can internationalize our foresight thinking in some shape or form. Then next year when we meet, we'll have maybe one or two ideas of how we should be doing it. So thank you very much indeed. Thank you.